Welcome to James Madison College at MSU. We appreciate our guests here in the room tonight and those watching the recording later. My name is Cameron Teese and I serve as the Dean of James Madison. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening for the Jack Paynter Endowed Lecture on the Theory and Practice of Politics. The Paynter Lecture is a signature event of the college held annually during the spring semester. Many of you knew Jack Paynter personally as colleagues. We're glad to have Professor Emeritus Dick Zinman with us here this evening. I know I saw him. Oh, there, he's right there. Other guests in the room include his grateful students who remember him fondly as well. I want to thank Peggy Bailey, Jack's widow, and a graduate of JMC's first class, and others for sharing their knowledge of Jack's career and contributions to James Madison. Peggy is also with us this evening to attend the lecture in person, which we appreciate, so thanks for being here. Jack Paynter served on the James Madison College and MSU faculties from 1969 until 1982. Jack played a crucial role in the early history of James Madison. He was instrumental in shaping the college as a whole, an architect of the justice, morality, and constitutional democracy field as it was known then, and a leader in creating the ethnic and intergroup relations field. As acting dean from 1979 to 1980, Jack provided the leadership needed to defeat an effort by the MSU administration to close the college as a cost-saving step. So in many ways, all that we have accomplished as a college since then, we owe to Jack's leadership in a time of crisis. Jack was a superb teacher, scholar, and colleague who had a profound impact on the lives of his students. He taught courses on a wide range of subjects, including classical liberalism, Adam Smith, Rousseau, Plato, American constitutional law, and race and social justice issues. These courses remain intellectual highlights for many of his students. In 1980 to 1981, he was the first Madison faculty member to receive MSU's Distinguished Faculty Award. In 2006, Jack's students, friends, family, and colleagues gathered to celebrate his life and career. They also raised the funds necessary to name the Jack Paynter Seminar Room in North Case Hall and to create this endowed lectureship both as permanent reminders of his service to James Madison. We would like to thank all the donors to the Paynter Fund who have made this lecture possible. We're pleased to welcome this year's keynote speaker, Dr. Robert Bartlett. Dr. Bartlett is a professor of Hellenic political studies at Boston College. His principal area of research is classical political philosophy, with particular attention to the thinkers of ancient Hellas, including Thucydides, Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle. He has published articles in the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Politics, the Journal of Politics, Review of Politics, and other leading scholarly journals. He is the author or editor of 8 books, including The Idea of Enlightenment, Plato's Protagoras and Meno, and Xenophon's The Shorter Socratic Writings. He is also the co-translator of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, the author of Sophistry and Political Philosophy, Protagoras' Challenge to Socrates, and a new edition of Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric. Prior to teaching at Boston College, Robert Bartlett served as the Arthur M. Blank National Endowment for the Humanities Distinguished Teaching Professor at Emory University. Following Dr. Bartlett's lecture, Dr. Emily Pears will respond with comments. She's an associate professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. She earned her BA in government from Claremont McKenna and her MA and PhD from the University of Virginia. She is the author of Chords of Affection, Constructing Constitutional Unity in Early American History, which won the Best Book Award from the American Political Thought section of the APSA. She has also been awarded the John Kincaid Award for the Best Article in Federalism and Intergovernmental Relations. Her current research and teaching are focused on questions of demagoguery in American politics and changing approaches to populism in American political thought. How timely. So welcome to Michigan State University, and thank you both for joining us this evening. We look forward to the discussion. Dr. Bartlett, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean, for that introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be at Michigan State here and to deliver the Jack Paynter Memorial Lecture. I've been asked to speak to you today on the theme of demagogues and democracy, and to do so on the basis of what might seem to be an odd authority, that of Aristophanes, who was certainly the greatest comic playwright in ancient Greece, and I would argue probably one of the greatest simply. One of his earliest plays, called The Knights, that's Knights with a K, deals with precisely the threat of a demagogue in democratic Athens, a man named Cleon. More on him in a minute. Now, some of you, and it seems to be a rather diverse group in age and in other respects, some of you may think that this theme of demagoguery is not funny, except the way I say it, and therefore does not lend itself to comedy, and there's something to that. But I can try to defend my procedure on 3 grounds. First, Aristophanes is an unusually perceptive and thoughtful comic. He's also a very political comic. As you can easily see, if you're not entirely distracted by his jokes about the bathroom and the bedroom and the temple, of which there are a great many in his plays. So it's just possible that we might learn something from him, from what he himself called his wise comedies. Second, if it's true, as I'm inclined to think that it is true, that our republic is now on the downward slope, we face the choice of either laughing or crying. And tonight, at least, I'm inclined to lean in the direction of laughter. But more than that, as comics from Aristophanes to Charlie Chaplin to George Carlin to Jon Stewart all knew well, laughter can have the very pleasing and beneficial effect, I think, of deflating boasters, of exposing frauds, and drawing up short those who need to be drawn up short, including, let me add, us ourselves, or we the people. So in order to speak about Aristophanes' Knights, which I'm going to devote the bulk of my remarks to, I want to sketch a bit of the background that informs the play. First, the Peloponnesian War. As some of you I'm sure know, in 431 BC, a shooting war broke out between the 2 great superpowers of the day. Athens, with its vast naval empire, they had a huge navy, and on the basis of that navy built a very impressive empire. And, of course, Sparta. You've heard of Sparta, with its assortment of Dorian allies, or Peloponnesians, who were dominant not at sea but on land. Now, given that our play was produced in 424, this means, for those of you who are not math majors, that the war was in its 7th year when this play was put on stage. So the war was an ongoing affair. An additional fact that features in the play, because it led to the ascendancy of our demagogue named Cleon, is this. In 428, there was a city named Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, and it revolted from Athens in the hope that it could dominate the whole island and rule it. And Sparta, of course, was egging it on, because every city that Athens lost was a chip that would fall to Sparta. But the Athenians found this act of revolt galling. Why? Because they had always treated Mytilene very well, with kid gloves. They allowed the city to keep its defensive walls. And it even allowed the city to keep its own warships, which usually Athens would immediately take away. And so what do they get for this nice treatment? They get a slap in the face from Mytilene. As Thucydides tells us, author of the Peloponnesian War, the Athenian assembly, and of course it was a democracy, met, and they were so outraged at Mytilene that they immediately passed a resolution to kill all of the adult males and enslave all of the women and children. The place would be smoking rubble. That's it. But Thucydides also tells us the next day the Athenians woke up and wondered whether they'd gone a bit far in their anger. Yes? And so they decided to convene a second assembly. We need to revisit this question of Mytilene. And here our man Cleon stood up. And according to Thucydides, Cleon is, quote, the most violent of the citizens and much the most persuasive with the demos at the time. And he rose up and gave a speech of fiery indignation, which Thucydides quotes, and says, "Stick to your guns. I don't think you're tough enough to have an empire. Are you? This is a test. We have to kill them all or enslave them all. That's it." And the speech, as recorded by Thucydides, is a very unfunny, very non-comic presentation of the character of Athens' leading demagogue. And so it's very helpful in bringing to life the speeches and the deeds of this man, Cleon, whom Aristophanes, by the way, generally calls Paphlagon, which means roughly the blusterer. Now, also as part of a background to the play, much more attractive in both Thucydides and the Knights, is Cleon's counterpart, his enemy, Demosthenes, who was a general in Athens. And early on in the war, Thucydides tells us, Demosthenes, on his own initiative, undertook to subdue a part of Aetolia, in the northwest. And he screwed up badly. Due to his own error and impatience, he suffered a terrible loss there. It was so bad, in fact, that Thucydides says, quote, the best men from the city of Athens died in that war. The best men of Athens died in that. And that was on Demosthenes' head. So terrible was his defeat, in fact, that Demosthenes refused to go back home because Athens generally treated its defeated generals rather harshly. But he didn't do nothing. He's a man of infinite resources. He regrouped, and he eventually redeemed himself, and really more than redeemed himself, first by gaining an important victory over the Ambraciots, and then by taking advantage of a chance storm. He'd come up with an idea. He wanted to establish a foothold on the Peloponnese itself, which is to say, in Sparta's backyard. Nobody was interested. But the terrible storm rose, and they were in a way forced to land at this place called Pylos. So he got lucky. And that move of capturing this little dinky place, in itself completely unimportant, called Pylos, allowed Demosthenes to launch a surprise attack on the adjacent island of Sphacteria. And on that island of Sphacteria was a huge prize, it turns out, because there were 420 Spartan hoplites, the cream of the crop, the sons of the Rockefellers and so on, were on that island. This stunning turn brought Sparta to the peace table. And it brought Cleon, our demagogue, again or still more to the forefront. Why? Because Athens convinced the Athenians to reject the Spartan peace overtures. And in fact, he mocked another general named Nicias, who's a key figure in our play, too, for his failure to have settled the matter by immediately bringing home the Spartans back to Athens as prisoners of war, which would be a prize beyond all prizes. Cleon says, Thucydides tells us, that, quote, if there were real men in command, men like him, they could do it immediately. Nicias, who was very cautious, called his bluff. Cleon balked, and the crowd gleefully goaded him on, as it is wont to do, as Thucydides says. And in the end, he was forced to accept the command, adding with a completely unearned bravado, I can do it in 20 days. You guys are wimps. I'm not. I'll do it. I'll go get those soldiers. And then we'll have Sparta by the Spartians, by the hoplites, yes? Cleon, however, was no fool. He was a blowhard and other things, but he was not a fool. And his first act was to appoint as co-commander Demosthenes. And in fact, it was Demosthenes who led the entire operation and succeeded. They raided the island and they captured these 420 Sparta hoplites. And in this way, Cleon's crazy boast that he could do it in 20 days was vindicated. Yeah. So beyond all expectations, he, really Demosthenes, pulled it off. And this means, for our purposes, a couple of things. It means that Cleon, as the curtain opened on Athens in 424, Cleon was riding extremely high. He was a hero, yeah? Aristophanes may treat Cleon as his punching bag, which he certainly does, but Aristophanes punches up. Cleon was the most powerful leader of the democracy right then. It's for this reason, too, that our play mentions Pylos some 14 times, because it was the site of this fantastic and unexpected victory. Demosthenes himself is made to complain that, quote, the other day, while he was kneading a Spartan barley cake at Pylos, how very much like the dirtiest crook that Cleon ran around me and snatched it up. And he himself served the cake that I'd kneaded, close quote. In other words, I did this and he took the credit. So this much then about the war and at least some of the doings of Cleon, Demosthenes, and Nicias, all of whom are in our play. But one final word of preparation before I turn to the play. And that's the word that I've already used several times, demos. Obviously, it forms the core of the word democracy in both English and in ancient Greek. And demos is often translated as people, and that's fine. If, however, we keep in mind this fact, that for us, I think, people, the word tends to mean everybody in the country, at least all citizens. Think, we the people, yeah? In ancient Greece, demos denotes one specific political class, if the largest class. That is, the poor majority who, as such, were largely uneducated. And so the demos has to be distinguished from the few, the oligoi, or the rich, or the better, or the virtuous. Fill in your adjective. Democracy, in other words, was not the rule of everybody, which is what we tend to think of it as, but the rule of the poor as distinguished from the rich, or even the middle class. And so a demagogue originally meant somebody who leads, from the verb ago, the demos. And I should say that it's not necessarily a term of derision, because you can lead the people well or you can lead them badly, after all. So in itself, it's a neutral term. But early on, it got a bad odor. And I think it's true to say that always in Aristophanes, demagogue is not a compliment. In fact, the first extant use of the term demagoguery appears in our play. So to turn to the play at long last. The Knights was performed at a leading dramatic festival, it was also democratic, in Athens, as I've said, in 424. And it won first prize, so it was a big hit. The most obvious theme of the Knights is entirely political. The restoration of Athenian democracy from its present decay, such that it will again be what it was during the days of Marathon and Salamis, when Athens fought off very nobly the aggression of the Persians, the Persian Wars. The greatest generation, in other words. Or, if you prefer, make Athens great again. That's the theme of the play. But the comic conceit at the heart of the play is this. Rather than depicting the city of Athens, Aristophanes instead portrays the city as a single household headed by Mr. Demos, who has three servants, Paphlagon or Cleon, Demosthenes, and Nicias. So he shrinks the whole city down to a single household. And this happy restoration of Athens is brought about, as we'll see, by two key events in the play. First, the rise of a hand-picked sausage seller, Agricritus by name, who proves to be instrumental in the fall of Cleon, and he even becomes the sole servant of the whole household. And second, the sausage seller's rejuvenation of the elderly and befuddled Mr. Demos by way of a miraculous boiling that renders him young and beautiful and sensible once again. And we'll come back to these. But these two events lead inevitably to a joyful ending, appropriate to a comedy, in which the sausage seller receives his just reward, Cleon gets his just punishment, and the household of Mr. Demos is set right top to bottom, curtain. Music, curtain, lights. Everything turns out hunky-dory. Both the leadership of the city and its people are, in the world of the comedy, vastly improved, and Aristophanes goes so far as to suggest or to say that the Peloponnesian War here in the play is brought to an end in the 7th year. In fact, it was going to last for 2 more decades. But in comedy, you can do what you like. So the obvious message of the play, then, is that Athens has to finally flush Cleon out of its political system. He's a dangerous and self-serving demagogue who only makes the demos worse, playing on their worst instincts, all the while lining his own pocket. Aristophanes hammers away at this point. In addition, since the removal of Cleon from public life requires, as we'll see, the cooperation of a very lowly sausage seller, the very distinguished general Demosthenes, and the wealthy knights who give our play its title, Aristophanes seems to suggest that a mixed regime, one that encompasses the poor, absolutely, but with the active cooperation of the upper classes, would be much better than a pure democracy. And as you probably know, Athens was a direct democracy at this time. Because democracy of that kind is always prone to demagogic manipulation. So, the opening scene. Demosthenes and Nicias are alone, and they begin by lamenting how bad their situation is. All the 11 plays of Aristophanes that survive begin with somebody complaining or moaning. Each is suffering daily at the hands of the new servant, Cleon, who in short order has wheedled his way into Mr. Demos's favor, and he's completely dominated the household, i.e. the city. It first falls to Demosthenes to take the initiative and seek out some salvation for the two of us. Nicias makes the first suggestion, and that is, we just escape. Let's run away from the household. Demosthenes isn't sure. And when Nicias can think of no better alternative than to, quote, prostrate ourselves before images of the gods, it turns out in Thucydides and here that Nicias was a deeply religious man, Demosthenes' blunt statement of incredulity at this, quote, do you really believe in gods? This makes plain how great the gulf is between the two men. And may I say parenthetically, later, it happened years later, these two generals were sent to Sicily, which proved to be the destruction of the Athenian Empire. And you see there in Thucydides the great difference in character between the two men. Nicias famously does produce here a proof of the existence of gods, and that is how much they must hate me. Because his life is so miserable. There have to be gods in charge of this, and they hate me. After Demosthenes, who's clearly the better speaker, breaks the fourth wall and explains to the audience their situation, Nicias can only repeat his suggestion, well, let's escape. Failing that, Nicias says, quote, the most excellent thing would be for us both to die. He just gives up. Demosthenes, who's tougher and wilier, does not. He suggests something you might try the next time you're stuck with a physics problem you can't solve. He suggests that he gets drunk. And in order to come up with a plan, to loosen up his mind, yes? And in his new state, in fact, Demosthenes conceives the idea of stealing the oracles, the prophetic announcements that are said to be in Cleon's possession. Demosthenes is thus led to the thought that the people's belief in oracles, their religiosity, could be of very great political use. And let me say, the play as a whole underscores the soundness of that suggestion. We'll come back to that. So Nicias goes into the house, very daringly steals the oracles from Cleon, and they learn of the following prophecy. Quote, well, not a quotation, I'll paraphrase. First must come as leader of Athens a dealer in oakum. Don't ask me what oakum is. A man named Eucrates. Then a dealer in sheep, a guy named Lysicles. Then, quote, another man, more loathsome than he is, will take the helm. Cleon, the leather seller. Apparently, Cleon's family dealt in leather, which was regarded as an extremely low thing to do. I don't know why, but Aristophanes just hammers away at this. So the prophecy foretells of the rise of the rule of sellers in Athens, and hence of the lower classes. And at least in the change from sheep seller to leather seller, the prophecy speaks explicitly of a decline. Athens would seem to be going from bad to worse. But most important, the next person destined to come along who will destroy Cleon will be, quote, possessed of an extraordinary art. He's destined to be a sausage seller. And when Nicias wonders, where could we find one? He himself announces in his very next breath the good news, but one's coming over into the marketplace, as if divinely. He sees it as a divine sign that a sausage seller walked into the marketplace at that very moment. Now, this sausage seller, who's minding his own business, hasn't the slightest interest in politics. He minds his own business. He has no desire to become a leader of the demos, the class to which he certainly belongs. Demosthenes lays out his future. And he's very modest. Quote, why, good fellow, don't you just let me wash my tripe and sell my sausages rather than make fun of me? He figures this fancy general is making fun of me. It turns out that the qualities the sausage seller thinks will preclude him from political greatness are the very ones that will guarantee it. He's low class, of the marketplace, bold, and all but uneducated in the things of the muses, or without refinement, we would say. Quote, for demagoguery no longer belongs to a man acquainted with the things of the muses, Demosthenes says, or to one whose ways are upright, but to one who's ignorant and loathsome, like you. It's perfect. That the sausage seller can barely read and write is cause for concern. If only he were completely illiterate. That would be so much better. Demosthenes' thought, which one could arrive at without recourse to any oracle, seems to be that only a man as crude as Cleon is or pretends to be can dislodge him from the favor he enjoys with the demos. Demosthenes has to out-Cleon Cleon. can't do it himself, therefore he needs a proxy. Hence, the sausage seller. But we can ask, to what end exactly, once Cleon is gone? Demosthenes convinces the sausage seller that the grand future thus sketched will be his. You'll control the assembly and the generals and the navy and the empire. It's really heady stuff. But the seller, being a sensible fellow, asks a sensible question. But I wonder how I can govern the demos. Demosthenes assures him that he'll need only to be who and what he already is. Quote, brutal voice, bad lineage, marketplace made. You have everything you need for political governance. Hence, the sausage seller is truly a born leader of the demos, a natural. And at this point in the play, Demosthenes cannot know just how true this is. The sausage seller proves out to be very impressive in his own way. But the sausage seller remains uncertain. Quote, and what ally will I have? For the wealthy are afraid of Cleon, and the crowd of the poor is petrified. Here Demosthenes speaks for the first time of that group of wealthy young men, the cavalry or the knights, that give our play its title, and the chorus. They form a chorus. Quote, but there are knights, 1,000 good men, who hate him. They'll come to your aid. In fact, the anti-Cleon coalition is broader than this, because it includes also, quote, the noble and good gentlemen among the citizenry, and whoever's clever among the spectators. And I, together with them, as well as the god, will help you. If all the knights have to be assumed to be gentlemen, not all gentlemen are of course knights. And the clever among the audience of Athenians is intended to be a term of distinction. The coalition against Cleon consists of strange bedfellows, the lowest of the demos, together with the elite, let's call them. You might say, as Thucydides says, that the sensible or moderate as such are opposed to Cleon. But it would be more precise to say, I think, that the coalition consists only of the members of the elite, who agree to make use of the sausage seller, or somebody like him, as their blunt instrument. The knights will soon say to Cleon, but in the presence of the sausage seller, that a man, quote, more of a reprobate than you are has appeared, who will outdo you, that's clear, on the spot, in crookedness and boldness and duping with stupid tricks. That the knights and the sausage seller can't be considered as anything more than temporary allies of convenience is clear. So, at Demosthenes' summons, the chorus of knights appear, dressed up as knights, come on stage, and they exhort the seller to attack Cleon. The importance of the knights to the whole scheme becomes clear immediately. Why? Because as soon as the blustering Cleon, he's a very intimidating guy, at least in speech, as soon as he first appears, in advance of the knights, before the knights get on stage, the sausage seller is very scared and is about to leave, yeah? His confidence or his courage returns only once the knights appear on stage to back him up. But the change in the Athenian politics that the elite have in mind can't be accomplished by brute force alone. Otherwise, they wouldn't need a sausage seller. They would just marshal their way in. That's not what they have in mind. Neither does their goal aim at replacing the democracy with an oligarchy or aristocracy, or still less a tyranny. There's no suggestion of that. Instead, Demosthenes and the knights seem to have it in mind to install a new leader of the demos, the democracy, hence of the democracy, but a leader with two outstanding qualifications from their point of view. First, a leader who can exceed even Cleon in, quote, shamelessness, in speech and deed. He'll say and do anything. A man who looks fondly on the gutter as a familiar haunt. And second, somebody who will pay heed to his betters or defer to them in policy matters. And the sausage seller so far gives every evidence of deference to them, to his betters. And he'll very soon demonstrate, beyond all doubt, his shamelessness in a number of scenes of verbal combat with Cleon that propriety prevents me from quoting today. I don't want to expand your vocabulary. Now, I've heard it said that this strategy of the upper classes making use of someone of the lower classes for political purposes all their own has a counterpart in modern political history. The upper-class German Junkers, dissatisfied with the Weimar democracy, sought out somebody who could talk the talk of the people while, as they hoped, doing their own bidding as their puppet. But the man the Junkers found for the job was named Adolf Hitler, who, of course, proved to have a very strong will of his own and ideas of his own. I mentioned this, but with the very great caution that I do not mean to compare the rather likable sausage seller to Hitler, but nonetheless, there's a certain political counterpart. Now, there proves to be a series of contests between Cleon and the sausage seller for supremacy over Mr. Demos, for the democracy, including a debate before the Athenian Council, which takes place off stage, and then a climactic contest before Mr. Demos himself that includes the presentation of competing oracles, more on that in a minute, and the final showdown that involves benefactions either performed or promised. Of the first contest, I'll note only a few things. Cleon initially expresses surprise at the hostility toward him of the knights, and his paper-thin attempts to win them over by flattery falls completely flat. They want nothing to do with him. However lowly his family's source of income in the leather trade, and again, this is something that Aristophanes hammers away at, Cleon does not consider himself of the demos or the multitude. He thinks he's above the demos. He boasts, in fact, of mocking Mr. Demos behind his back, even as he curries favor with him. Cleon, then, you could say, is between two chairs. He's a lowly seller who nonetheless despises Mr. Demos and yet has to fawn over him for ends of his own purpose, for ends of his own. And he is in turn despised by the knights and the wealthy more generally. In our own time, perhaps you can think of someone who is very wealthy, but also very crude or vulgar, and so is not really of the demos, but isn't old money either. A psychologically difficult state, I suspect. And if the knights have only contempt for Cleon, they take delight in the sausage seller, as he stands toe-to-toe with Cleon in the delivery of eye-watering abuse and tit-for-tat vulgarities. Their praise of him advances from, "O most clever flesh," to "O most noble flesh and best in soul of all," to "the greatest benefit to all human beings." The knights see in this guy's unflinching feistiness, his utter shamelessness, the means to their own de facto victory. Well, after a choral song, there's lots of singing in the play, the sausage seller returns from the council off stage, and he gives a very animated report of the proceedings that had just taken place. He says by the time he got to the council, Cleon was there, unleashing, quote, thunder-hurling words and uttering amazing things against the knights. Then the sausage seller addressed the council. He gains their favor, first with the news that since the war broke out, sprats have never been cheaper. Inflation is under control, ladies and gentlemen. He thus appeals to their economic interests and to their bellies. Cleon doesn't dispute the news, but appeals instead to their higher concerns by suggesting that they sacrifice, quote, 100 bulls to the goddess Athena in thanks. The sausage seller does him one or two better. He proposes that they sacrifice 200 bulls in thanks, which would cost far more than their savings in sprats. And if anchovies go for 100 a penny, that they add to the sacrifice 1,000 goats. The combination of economic benefit and delicious food with ostentatious piety proves irresistible to the council. The council rejects out of hand Cleon's attempt to regain their favor when he suggests that they listen to a Spartan herald who's come to negotiate a peace treaty. Why agree to peace, they think, when things are going so well? Now, this plea for peace on Cleon's part is an astonishing about-face, because he is always the most vocal proponent of the war. But it would be wrong to accuse Cleon of operating here without principle, one day pro-war, the next day anti-war, because the clear principle that guides Cleon in everything is his own advancement. Questions of policy, even of war and peace, amount to mere details by comparison and are always negotiable. Finally, the old curmudgeon, Mr. Demos himself, appears, and both Cleon and the sausage seller vie for his favor by appealing to the friendship and indeed even the love they say they feel for him. Here, Aristophanes puts before us a fact about democratic politics that should make us a little uncomfortable. All politicians have to constantly curry favor with the electorate And that means promising an unending series of benefits, goodies, and perks, and flattery. Ladies and gentlemen, unending flattery. It is simply impossible for any serious candidate running for a major office in a democracy to criticize the people as such. En masse, ladies and gentlemen, you and I are simply perfect. We are beyond reproach. I have a wager with my students every presidential election that if a serious candidate for president utters a single criticism of the American people, that I'll buy them a dinner at a restaurant of their choosing. I've never yet had to do this. The last candidate for president, as far as I know, who came close to criticizing the American people, Jimmy Carter, in his so-called Malaise speech, had his hat handed to him by Ronald Reagan. Cleon has the advantage in this contest because he can appeal to past deeds he's done as a commander who sailed to Pylos, thereby screwing up the comic conceit of the play. The sausage seller, by contrast, shows his love by venturing what is the only criticism of Mr. Demos stated to his face in the play, at least prior to his rejuvenation. Quote, "For you are like the boys who are the objects of love. You don't accept those who are noble and good gentlemen, but give yourself to lamp sellers and shoe menders, and leather workers and hide sellers." Here, at any rate, the sausage seller seeks not to flatter, but to improve Mr. Demos. But let's not forget this blunt talk occurs on stage and in a comedy. Still, the contest between these two lovers of Mr. Demos mostly revolves around flattery and the performance of benefits, past, present, and future. In short order, the sausage seller produces a cushion for Mr. Demos's behind, the very behind that sat on the ships, the benches of the ships at Salamis. He gives him shoes for his feet, a warm winter cloak, medicine for his shins, and a soft rabbit's tail with which to daub his eyes. The concern for bodily health and comfort constitutes a great part of democratic politics, then and now. Medicare and Social Security, ladies and gentlemen. And since Cleon can match him in none of these, his decline begins. Accordingly, Cleon has to rely on the heavy artillery. He begs Mr. Demos, whom he here calls my master, to listen to oracles and prophecies in his possession. And not to be outdone, the sausage seller too claims to have a vast store of them. Here Aristophanes mocks both the proliferation of oracles and the notorious ambiguity of them. Right prior to the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, for example, he says, both sides went to Delphi, the oracle at Delphi. Should we, shouldn't we? And the Delphic oracle said to the Spartans, "You will win if you fight with all your might." There was often an if clause to get them out of trouble. Mr. Demos can't make head nor tail of these oracles. And of course, Cleon interprets them to his advantage, and the sausage seller interprets them to his own advantage. But in the end of this scene, Demos clearly prefers the sausage seller to Cleon. When we next see the sausage seller, he's a completely new man. He's in charge of Mr. Demos and the household. And he soon presents to us the miracle that he's been working on off stage. He brings to us now Mr. Demos, who's been boiled, I like to think in hot dog water, I don't know. And he's made him beautiful and young once again, just as he was 60 years ago, in the days of Aristides and Miltiades. And here, too, the sausage seller ventures to criticize Mr. Demos to his face, telling him how foolish he was in his old age. Ladies and gentlemen, if only there were a way for us, too, to effect the miracle of making a 77-year-old or an 81-year-old young and beautiful and sensible once again. If, in fact, either of those men was ever sensible, I don't know. We learn now how the new Mr. Demos will administer his household, or in political terms, how the new Athens will be governed now that the Demos has been reinvigorated. He's 28 again. The first matters he discusses with the sausage seller take up the military, understandably. The Navy has to be maintained, and there's to be no delay in paying the sailors who were of the lowest classes, the poorest. There's also a certain restriction on the hoplites, who were the middle classes. Strange is the fact that they never mentioned the cavalry, the upper classes. It's not clear where they fit in the new order. And as Aristophanes often does, he has a peace treaty, in this case, a 30-year peace treaty personified, comes on stage, often a beautiful young woman. And the end of the war allows Demos to return to the fields. Athens had always been a very agricultural place. So it only remains to punish Cleon, and this the sausage seller does with remarkable gentleness. He has to go take up the art of sausage selling at the city gates. So they switch places. So the new Athens will remain a democracy. The temporary cooperation of Demosthenes, the knights, the gentleman, and the sausage seller does not in fact result in a mixed regime, despite one's contrary initial expectation perhaps. For the sausage seller here reigns supreme and alone. He's at least as much in charge of the city as Cleon ever was, although I think he's a much, much better man than Cleon was. Democratic Athens will, in addition, be largely rural again, founded on the mostly conservative agricultural or farming populace that shuns the city and its modish ways. Thomas Jefferson would approve. Of course, if the demos does return to the fields, it will only occasionally take a hand in the governance of the city. Day-to-day governance will fall to the remarkably skillful administration of the sausage seller. Athens will maintain its military excellence, that seems to be clear, and be as brave in defense of itself as it ever was. Less clear, at least to me, is the fate of the empire in the new dispensation, but the preservation of the navy certainly allows for that. So, the new Athens will make possible for most citizens a peaceful, bucolic existence under, as I say, the remarkably capable administration of the seller. And I think we have to give him his due. Lacking in education though he is remarkably clever or cagey. He's not without courage, or at least a certain boldness, and he's possessed of a native intelligence. It becomes clear in the course of the play that he's followed current events, and he cites all the recent things. The sausage seller naturally rises to the top when given the opportunity to do so. And this despite the fact that he's entirely without political ambition. Once earlier in his life, and when he meets Demosthenes, who predicts this great future, he doesn't have any interest. This doesn't fire his ambition. He rules, and he rules well without seeking to rule. This accords with the old adage that those who are hungriest to rule are for that very reason least fit to rule. The seller comes into view here as the natural leader of a democracy. He's devoted to the demos as to a father. He's eager to aid it in all things, but also willing to criticize it when that's due. He's not clamoring for rule, begging for it, but he is willing to take it on when called on to do so. Alas, such a figure seems to be a comic invention. Well, there's just one massive problem with this otherwise very pleasing spectacle at the end of the play. The transformation of Mr. Demos and all the rest of it depends on things either impossible or very unlikely. The comic impossibility that is boiling Demos, I ask you, what is the real world equivalent of boiling Mr. Demos? And the chance discovery of so naturally a gifted ruler as the sausage seller. And so we have to ask, is a return to the golden age of Athenian democracy really possible, according to Aristophanes? And I think the answer to this question, I fear, is no. Because that age, if it was a golden age, is gone and gone for good. There's no real-world, non-comic equivalent of boiling Mr. Demos. Civic virtues once lost are exceedingly difficult to regain. But this thought needn't lead to despair over the fate of Athenian democracy or democracy as such. This is so, I think, because the clearest message of the Knights remains true. Athens should rid itself of Cleon and guard against taking on another one like him. That step is possible, and it's worth taking. How? By ridiculing Cleon mercilessly and repeatedly, Aristophanes does all that he can to strip the luster off Cleon, to defang him, to puncture his bluster and his bravado. In that respect, Aristophanes dares to teach what he calls the just things. And to that end, Aristophanes can be at least as vulgar as the sausage seller. And again, like the seller, he shows no interest in ruling Athens himself. but he's also wiser than the sausage seller. Aristophanes, you could say, is a sort of super sausage seller, not easy to say, who tries in his comedies to effect a boiling of the Athenian demos, even as he remains entirely sober about the prospects. In other words, the comedy itself is a real-world equivalent, to the extent that there is one, of boiling the demos, of making them better, or at any rate less foolish. And small improvements are worth taking. In the Knights, we're witnesses to both the decline of Athens and its wonderful restoration by the end of the play. That restoration, to repeat, belongs in a comedy because it's comically impossible. It's outlandish. Quote, all things by nature also decline, as Behrakis himself once went so far to say publicly. Within the confines of the comedy, we see this succession of leaders: Eucrates, Lysicles, Cleon, the sausage seller. Hence, the decline is stopped and even reversed. But Aristophanes points us in the direction of the truth, because Cleon was followed, in fact, not by some sausage seller, but by another demagogue who was at least as bad as he was, named Hyperbolus, who also appears in the play. So if political decline is inevitable, are we compelled simply to accept that harsh fact? Despite the barrage of criticism and ridicule that's directed squarely at Cleon throughout the play, Aristophanes does at one point permit this praise of the man by certain elders. Quote, if Cleon had not become great in the city, there'd never have been those two useful implements, a pestle and a ladle. In other words, it can't be denied that Cleon was instrumental in attacking Athens' enemies, the pestle, and adding to its coffers, the ladle. From a narrowly political point of view, Cleon is not so easily to be condemned, or maybe even is to be praised. A majority of Athenians, after all, found him very much to their liking for a good many years. Another uncomfortable fact, then, that this play puts before us: demagogues, leaders of the demos, can do what they do only because there is a demos willing and even eager to follow them. Blame of the demagogue must at some point include blame of the demos, doesn't it? But to return to the matter of political decline, Aristophanes hints at some consolations to be had even amidst such decline. The olden times celebrated here included Miltiades, Aristides, and Aeschylus, the old-fashioned poet. The debased present includes Cleon and the sausage seller, true, but also the great poet Euripides, who's mentioned, and Aristophanes. Would the very comedy that delighted and instructed the Athenians be possible in times of the greatest public rectitude? A highly developed education in the things of the muses, culture we would say, is possible in at least some decadent times. Decadent judged from the point of view of a political or military excellence. At one point, Athens is praised in the following terms in the play: that it surpasses all other cities in, quote, war and poets and power. This praise of the city captures something beautifully, because Athens is impressive for its power, of course, but also for its poets, let us say for the life of the mind that it made possible. So Cleon can be praised for giving to his city a pestle and a ladle, and he can be condemned, Aristophanes does condemn him, for the swinishness of his education in the things of the muses. Athens, to its credit, had both for a while: very great political power and an extraordinary bloom of the human mind, which included Aristophanes. And it was possible, perhaps to some extent it was encouraged, even by a certain political decline. 3 points by way of conclusion. Let me say the most beautiful phrase in the English language. Do you know it? In conclusion. This is very beautiful. First, Aristophanes stresses how readily the Athenian people are persuaded by oracles, so-called oracles. The manipulation, in other words, of religious belief for political purposes is a constant danger in democracy, not only, but certainly in democracy. For us, the First Amendment, or the separation of church and state, has surely curtailed such abuse. But whether it has eliminated it, I leave it for others to say. Second, Aristophanes underscores the great power of flattery and the promise of future benefits that miraculously come with no price tag, or a price that somebody else will pay. For example, the rich, these nasty people, free medical care, or student loans that suddenly vanish. Isn't it wonderful? This feature of American political life no doubt remains. But the next time we are promised something that sounds too good to be true, or above all when we are being praised, and you're the best audience I've ever had, let us at least pause to wonder whether we aren't being played. I say parenthetically, I gave a very different lecture on rhetoric at a certain college. And I began by saying, it's a great honor to be at what I regard as the finest college in the country. And the place just exploded in applause. And about 20 minutes later, I think it dawned on some of them that this was a speech about rhetoric. But I digress. Finally, Aristophanes seems to hold out the promise of a sort of mixed regime. The sausage seller, Demosthenes, and the knights all somehow working together. But that doesn't really pan out. The democracy remains the democracy, but with a better leader for a time. Injecting a moderation into democracy, or a kind of leavening, is exceedingly difficult to do. The one thing that democracy seems to crave is more democracy. Here, I think, we can begin at least to appreciate the genius of the American founding, because ours is a sort of mixed regime, at least to the extent that both local, state, and federal governments are meant to balance one another. And at the national level, the balance of powers and institutional arrangements are intended, among other things, to have ambition check ambition. We can talk more about this, of course. In the end, however, there can be no substitute for a demos, a people, too sensible to fall for the manipulations of a demagogue. And that, of course, remains the challenge. Try to rise to it. Thank you very much.
You were inching forward as you went. There we go. All right. Is that working? Good enough. Thank you. All right, well, thank you. I want to start by thanking you all for having me here. I am regrettably an Americanist and not a political theorist. And Americanists are really the sausage sellers of the political science world. We are lacking somewhat in refinement and the higher virtues, but ultimately useful enough to those who are capable of asking the big questions. We provide some utility to the others. As an Americanist, I, of course, know nothing of any country other than America, and my historical frame of reference begins in 1776, and it ends whenever the most recently available data set ends. But since 2017, I've taught a class at Claremont McKenna called Patriots and Demagogues. It's really a sort of combination of theory and American political history that develops theories of demagoguery in American politics from case studies of both good and bad political leadership. So we look at Washington and Lincoln and Reagan and middling sorts like Andrew Jackson and William Jennings Bryan and Teddy Roosevelt. And then we look at bad guys like Benjamin Tillman and George Wallace and Huey Long. And I've written a bit about demagoguery in American politics and am sort of partway through a book on it now. In many ways, the American founders picked up right where Aristophanes leaves off. They were deeply engaged with the question of demagoguery, and they were engaged with it precisely because it had played a key role, they observed, in the downfall of the ancient regimes. So how do the founders describe the problem of demagoguery for a democracy? Well, in the very first Federalist paper, Alexander Hamilton, in warning the people of the dangers of anti-Federalist propaganda, writes that a dangerous ambition more often lurks behind the specious mask of zeal for the rights of people than under the forbidden appearance of zeal for the firmness and efficiency of government. History will teach us that the former has been found a much more certain road to the introduction of despotism than the latter, and that of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. In other words, institutionalism is perennially unpopular. You can ask Liz Cheney that. But the guys who say that they were defending your rights and representing your interests are just as likely, if not more so, to be serving their own ends than yours. So how will these men go about destroying liberty in a Republican government, according to our founders? As Madison writes in Federalist 58, in the ancient republics where the whole body of the people assembled in person, a single order or an artful statesman was generally seen to rule with as complete a sway as if a scepter had been placed in his single hand. Large bodies of people, all assembled together and ruling together, were subject to these sudden and violent passions that would seduce them into advancing intemperate and pernicious resolutions. Essentially, when brought all together, the people have a tendency to be swayed not towards deliberative democracy and reason, but towards emotion and passion-driven choices. So the American founders looked at the ancients and recognized first and foremost that even in the best of times, the people ruling themselves in a direct democracy don't do a great job. They have fallible reason, they're easily enticed by hot new ideas. So direct democracies and governance by single large assemblies is also chaotic, and it thus invites structure and leadership in the form of the demagogue. Men with talents for low intrigue and the little arts of popularity, or even worse, those of factious tempers, local prejudices, or sinister designs, would take charge of the assembly and mislead the people. Madison argues in Federalist 10 that America's first tool in mitigating the impact of demagoguery relative to the ancient republics would be to employ the Republican principle of representation. That would keep sovereignty in the people's hands, but would allow for refining and enlarging of the public's views. Still, though, as Madison writes, these men of factious tempers could, by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means, first obtain the suffrages and then betray the interests of the people. So while the public is better at selecting leaders and judging their character than they are at lawmaking, and America's large size and diversity will ensure a pretty good pool of candidates for office, the demagogic type can still get elected to office in a representative democracy. As a result, the founders built still more structural controls in to prevent a demagogue who does manage to get elected from becoming a tyrant. Longer terms in office, in the Senate in particular, will encourage lawmakers not to comply with every transient impulse which the people receive from the arts of men who flatter their prejudices. This point is, I think, worth dwelling on. The threat for the founders does not come from the leader who wishes to cast aside public opinion in favor of ruling based on what he thinks is best, even for these revolutionaries who have just recently overthrown a monarchy. Instead, the threat comes from the people's ability in their collective state to be so easily swayed. It's often in the Federalist Papers the absolutely uncontrollable power of populist and popular passions that is most dangerous to American liberty. The demagogue is a danger because of his ability to, though so often only temporarily, tame or ride that popular wave. Power derived from constitutional office is always safer than power derived from popularity. 3 other formal structures were built into the constitutional system to help either keep demagogues out of office or ensure that they're unable to carry their design into effect once they get there. The Electoral College has been almost completely defanged, but its original design, with electors who meet only once in capitals across the country and who were chosen only for the purpose of selecting the president, ensured that a great orator or popular leader would be filtered out of the presidential selection process and be rendered unable to corrupt the entirety of the system. And if a demagogue were to get through, checks and balances would significantly constrain his power. Ambitious presidents would be checked by ambitious House speakers, and all would be kept in their respective constitutional cages. The last major structural tool used to prevent demagoguery in the American system came later, not coincidentally, from Martin Van Buren in the wake of Andrew Jackson's rise to power. The party system was, in Van Buren's vision, a tool to channel ambition and talented political types towards a kind of constitutionalism. party leaders would, through the nomination process, filter out the demagogues from the potential statesmen, and party platforms would constrain what office holders could ultimately advocate for. I think that process in some ways echoes what the Knights hoped to accomplish by elevating a leader who would defer to them on issues of policy. And like that mixed regime, the constraint offered by party in America has also failed, or has not produced the kind of constraint on leaders, on presidential leaders, as it might have. America's concern with demagoguery didn't, of course, end in 1789, or even with Van Buren in the 1820s. Perhaps the most striking and important speech on demagoguery from the American political tradition comes to us from a young Abraham Lincoln in the form of the speech to the Young Men's Lyceum in 1838. There he raises the concern that men of ambition, those who belong to the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle, will inevitably come along as the republic ages. The problem is that these men of ambition want to take action. The American field of glory is harvested, but new reapers will arise. They want to build something. They want to be founders. As Lincoln puts it, towering genius disdains a beaten path. Lincoln wonders whether they will be willing or able to confine their ambition to regime maintenance, whether there will be enough glory in upholding the law rather than writing the Constitution. Lincoln warns that to combat this specter of the ambitious man, Americans must make the Constitution their religion and must have cold, calculating reason as the basis of their patriotism. Here, I think like in the play, we see the political utility of religiosity. But for Lincoln, the religion should be of the Constitution, not a separate religion. Many decades later, Woodrow Wilson, continuing a tradition begun by Jefferson in the founding era, argued that this was all blown entirely out of proportion. I'm not sure how much Wilson looked to the ancient republics, if at all, but actually his conclusion about the threat that demagoguery poses to democracy is not all that different from what Aristophanes seems to ultimately conclude. Wilson argued that the people, by the turn of the century, were too wise to ever elect a demagogue. Instead, the institutional constraints the founders put in place, ostensibly to protect the people from their own tendency to follow sophists and men of factious tempers, were merely serving to stifle the public will and prevent the people from enacting the laws they deemed fit. Instead of distrusting public opinion because of its tendency to be shaped by demagoguery, we should empower the people to govern more directly. If they chose leaders who utilize passion-driven rhetoric or push the boundaries of constitutional constraint, so be it. Give the people what they want. The progressive movement from which Wilson's thinking is derived did an enormous amount of work, in fact, to dismantle the founders' protections against demagoguery. Progressive era reforms around primary elections, initiative, referendum, and recall, and expanded suffrage all worked to bring America closer to the democracy of ancient Athens than to the republicanism of 1789. Social media has essentially put every American voter in the same room with every other American voter, and the rhetorical arts, now maybe in the form of Twitter, are again the key to political power. Distance between the people and policy is tagged not as the sensible result of a process of refining and enlarging the public's views, but as undemocratic corruption. So what have I learned today from Aristophanes, as someone who studies demagoguery in America and generally knows next to nothing about other countries or earlier time periods? First, I think the play seems to suggest that it's not possible to cultivate virtue in the demos as a means of constraining the demagogue. An individual, like the sausage seller, can be molded into a kind of statesman, but the mass of the public is not going to themselves police the boundaries of appropriate constitutional leadership. Demagoguery is just too much fun. The founders, I think, recognized this and agreed. With the notable exception of Jefferson, they put their faith in institutional constraints that would structurally channel leaders towards civic virtue rather than trying to cultivate that civic virtue in the citizenry, hoping that they would turn their backs on any demagogue that came along. In the wake of President Trump's election, and again after January 6th, many scholars and pundits called for increased civic education in America as a means of ensuring that demagoguery would not be tolerated. While the plot of the play suggests that cultivating civic virtue or civic education of the broad public is not a particularly viable option, Aristophanes presumably does intend for the play itself to be a kind of civic education. So then, is Saturday Night Live the answer? Or something else? What lessons should we draw from Aristophanes about how best to draw public attention to the dangers of demagoguery in a way that doesn't bore them to death or lead to accusations that an entitled, stodgy professorship is forcing institutionalism down everyone's throats? Perhaps part of the answer lies in the distinction between the demos and the oligoi as one in terms of which is to be educated or which is capable of being educated. I wonder whether civic education in an enticing enough form might accomplish the goal of boiling the demos. Second, I've talked about how Madison and Hamilton embraced institutional structure as tools to prevent demagoguery, and how Jefferson and later Wilson thought the people were capable of protecting their own democracy. George Washington, both prior to and during his presidency, was also deeply concerned with the specter of demagoguery. What Washington tried to do as president was to establish norms of conduct that would channel leaders towards Republican statesmanship and away from the kinds of populist and rhetorical tools most often employed by demagogues. Political science definitions of demagoguery often have two features to them. They identify demagogic means or tools and demagogic ends. Demagogues use emotion and passion-driven rhetoric, fear-mongering, divisiveness, name-calling, and crowd-captivating tricks in order to advance their own ends as opposed to the good of the whole, or to overturn institutions and bypass the rule of law. For Washington, and ultimately for many other leaders throughout American history, the norms of appropriate behavior in office do as much, if not more, than institutional constraints to channel leaders away from demagoguery and towards statesmanship. Given how dramatically many of the founders' institutional safeguards against demagoguery have been dismantled over time, I would venture to say that norms of appropriate behavior in politics and in office have been the primary constraint on demagogic leadership in the last 50 years. Aristophanes suggests that once the demos has a taste of demagoguery, there's not really any going back. The virtuous political leaders left behind are forced to fight fire with fire and to engage in precisely the same kinds of means and tools that the demagogue himself utilizes. What remains then is to somehow separate the self-serving demagogues from the statesmen who utilize demagogic tactics. The problem is that's really hard. It requires the public to judge leaders based not on what they say or how they say it, but rather their end goals or motivations. That process of separating demagogues from demagoguery utilizing statesmen is all but impossible if we want to be able to identify demagogues among our friends with equal accuracy as we identify them among our enemies. I hold out some hope that in pointing to the absurdity of defeating the demagogue with the sausage seller, we can curry some favor for statesmanship. That just as a bored and neglected public is awakened by the fun and entertainment of demagogic pandering, a frustrated public, accustomed to name-calling, divisiveness, and the low arts of popularity, will be enchanted by truly elevated statesmanship when it comes along, so that what is old will seem new again. Thank you.
We're to be subjected to questions, grilling. At this point. Yes. Dr. Rodriguez.
Yeah, thank you very much. Should I use my, thank you very much for your talk. I'd like to, I guess, begin where we ended and go back to where we began.
Yeah.
This question of statesmanship. Your discussion of Thucydides at the beginning of Mississippi lived around here. We talked about how vicious Leon was. This question of statesmanship reminded me, well, how it's resolved in Thucydides. There's Dialectics that sort of calms the opinion of people. And it's really statesmanship that solves the sort of problem in the topic of Leon. I was wondering if you could sort of speak a little bit to that. I guess somewhat related to this is the poetic critique of talking about that. I'm sort of interested in what might be a historian critique of demagoguery,
Yeah.
or philosophical critique of demagoguery, or what touched on this.
Yeah, thank you. What Professor Rodriguez is alluding to, as some of you I'm sure know, is a very famous debate in Thucydides, presented as such, between Cleon and Diodotus, over the question of the Mytilenes, which I mentioned. What should we do with this island that has revolted? No one denies that they revolted. And Cleon gives this fiery speech, stick to our resolution of yesterday, which was to kill them all and enslave them. And then Professor Rodriguez is, of course, quite right. A man named Diodotus, whom we otherwise know nothing about, stood up and gave a very interesting, clever, and complicated speech which calmed people down. And in fact, Cleon lost the vote, let us say. So they only killed the ringleaders. I mean, it was still blood, but it was much gentler than it would have been. Now, I don't know how far we want to go into the strategy of Diodotus' speech here, but I guess the main point you're raising is that at least in that case, it was a certain statesmanship and an extraordinary rhetorical skill which thwarted the demagogic instinct. That seems to me true. The difficulty is that means we rely on someone as skilled as Diodotus, who, he and Thucydides in a way underscores the point. He pops up one day, gives this speech, and is never mentioned or alluded to again. And it's possible, some have speculated, that Thucydides made him up. His name means gift of Zeus. So, but in principle, I don't see why it couldn't happen, that someone who sees. But Diodotus does one clever thing, without getting into too many details. What is the mood, the moral mood of that audience? On the one hand, they're mad as hell because these bastards have just slapped us in the face. On the other hand, there wouldn't be a second assembly if they didn't feel, like you explode at somebody and then 20 minutes later, you're a little embarrassed because maybe you went overboard. They wonder whether they're in the grip of a certain moral reservation. And Demosthenes' speech is brilliant in as much as it appeals to that moral reservation in the guise of a tougher-than-tough speech. I don't give a damn what justice says. The only thing I care about is Athenian advantage. And it is not to our advantage to kill these people. So he comes off as a tougher-than-tough guy. And then at the end of the speech, he says, oh, and by the way, it would be unjust if we kill these people, which is what they had been worried about. And so he speaks both to their moral concern quietly, encased in a tougher-than-tough realpolitik kind of analysis. So it's a very brilliant speech. I don't see why it couldn't happen, but in a way that points to the problem, that it would require someone on the spot, a new Lincoln, and they come along very rarely. Professor Simon.
Each of you. In some ways, you offer no hope. And you offer what I would call a pious hope, the hope that the right person will come along. But aside from that, the question I have is, for you is this, and you can either talk about Aristophanes or you can talk about this whatever perspective you have. While it may very well be the case that once a democratic regime reaches a level of decay, there is no hope for resuscitation.
Yeah.
Well, then what do you advise under those circumstances? And in your case, somewhat maybe a slightly easier question, but really it's the same question. If it's true that one of the clear virtues of the founding generation was its clarity about the nature of democracy, which certainly is true of the ancients in general, but Aristophanes in particular. So they constructed a system, as you presented, which is almost exclusively institutional. And you also say those institutions have all, in a way, failed to prevent exactly what they were designed to prevent. They may have succeeded in other respects, but in the greatest danger confronts us, as you understand. So again, what do we do? I mean, does that mean that we should? Is it possible to try to resuscitate these institutions, or do you really leave us with a situation where, I mean, both of you, in a way, leave us with a situation in which, if you're public spirited, do you just throw up your hands and wait for what? Tyranny, civil war, tyranny, or so what would Aristophanes say? What would your founders say? I know that's a big question, but
It's a very big
it
question.
seems to me that
Well, first I want to say that I do enjoy going around the country spreading hopelessness. So, those of you who started the day in a good mood, well, I hope I've destroyed that for you. No, I mean, Aristophanes was not led to cry, he was led to laugh. Now, that may be his peculiar characteristic. On the one hand, if we have problems and serious problems, it doesn't help to put our head in the sand. We should recognize them as such. The cancer doesn't get better by wishing, or by saying, well, it must be a cold. You know? So if we're in some decline or we're in some trouble, then I think we need to face that fact. It's a very difficult order, at least for me, to give political prescriptions in 2024 from an ancient play. And especially a comedy. But there are some massive differences which I alluded to between then and now. Then, for example, democracy really does mean something quite different than what we mean by it. Why? Among other reasons, it was very small. Athens had 40,000 citizens, so it's a small Midwest town, you know. And the demos was poor and therefore uneducated. And the therefore is important because the whole rationale for public education in the United States is to have an informed electorate. Now, how well that's working, we can talk about or debate. But nonetheless, that's the impetus, and there's nothing comparable to that in ancient Athens. There wasn't public education such as we know it. So if you were too poor and had to work at 14, you had to work at 14, and that was the end of your education. And so that was the demos that ruled by their votes, by the majority votes. And it was typically, therefore, more susceptible to this kind of manipulation. So by day, I earn my keep. I try to earn my keep, at least, as an educator. And one of the tasks, I think, is to help keep a certain tradition alive and a certain awareness of both the promise and the very great dangers of democracy in its health and in its debasement. I'm not pretending that I can prevent the decline, but maybe a large enough group of educators who have some concern for these things could at least slow the decline. And there was a sentence in my remarks that said something about civic virtues once lost are very difficult to regain. It's true that in an earlier version I said are impossible to regain. But then I changed it because I didn't want to be so gloomy. And I don't know. I mean, I think it's difficult. You know, if you develop bad habits, it is difficult to break them, but not impossible. In the more contemporary setting of the United States, and here I would defer to my colleague, and I alluded to these things at the very end when I turned to the United States. I really do think that the founders had a very keen awareness of the problem. This is not supposed to be a democracy, a direct democracy. It's a republic of a certain kind. For very good reasons. And I would say, insofar as the institutional checks can be maintained and supported and strengthened, they should be. A lot is made of the fact, and we're all, in a way, talking about Trump without mentioning him, or barely mentioning him, is his proto-fascistic tendencies, and I'm not sure I agree with that, but let's say, for the sake of argument, that's so. I would say the institutions held. Courts held, the Congress held. The election, in fact, went on, and the results were tabulated, and here we are. Maybe that's Pollyannish, and feel free to come at me, but I would say the institutions held. Did you want to respond to that?
I think to that last point, so I agree that one way to talk about some hope in the decline of American democracy today is that many, if you do think that Trump is a demagogue, then I think many of the institutions did hold, almost all of them. The ones that failed were the ones, again, if you think Trump is a demagogue, that allowed him into office in the first place. Those are electoral institutions, and those are the ones that have changed the most since the founding. I also think that there is appetite for a different understanding of the role of parties in American democracy. I think a lot of people are dissatisfied with both political parties, and that a world where parties may play a different role and a more powerful role in organizing and constraining the way that democracy works, that is something that I think people are open to, and that isn't this foregone conclusion of decline.
Let me just add one thing. It would be wrong of me not to say in a group of largely 18 to 22-year-olds, what are you waiting for? It's up to you. If you're troubled, as you should be troubled, I think, about the future of the country, well, don't just sit there. Yes.
My question is for both of you. And Zimmern told me yesterday if I asked my violent question, that would be
Your which question?
my violent.
Oh, your violent question.
What, I don't know.
Come at me, old man.
Today,
Yes.
today, 2024, about 4 years ago, if the sausage seller isn't popular enough to be clean, and if the majority of Americans no longer really hold reverence for the law, and if the large size of our republic is ineffective to mitigate ultra-partisanship and internet age, how is a demagogue to be snug? And then my final second question is assassination a legitimate solution? That upsets him very much. So I was calling it school war.
Luckily, this is being filmed. Well, as to your first point, I agree completely, or I think I agree completely. There are real dangers, and that's why we're gathered here, and why I bothered to resurrect this old play, and so on. As to the second question, no. As a matter of principle, I strongly disagree with that as a political solution, because for among other reasons, it's morally wrong, but also surely it would have immediate and violent political repercussions that it would be very difficult to predict in their particularities, but in general, then you unleash something which could be far worse than the problem you're attempting to cure. You can cure a broken leg by cutting it off, then you no longer have a broken leg. That's true.
52 years ago, a bus filled with James Madison students like each drove from here over to the old Lansing Civic Center because George Wallace was coming in to make his last pitch to win the Michigan Democratic primary, which several weeks later he did and won. In the meantime, he went to a shopping center in Maryland and he was shot. And that was the end of his demagogic deeds. Now, is that just the fates intervening to be nice? Can we not hope for that sort of result today? Is that too barbaric? I don't know. What do you think?
First, I don't believe in fates, and second, I still maintain I refuse to accept that as an adequate political solution to our problems. Yes.
I have a less violent question. I wanted to ask both of you a question regarding Dr. Pears' last two suggestions about civic education and then norms of conduct. So I think we sort of said civic education seems difficult because it would require boiling the demos in some way, which seems hard. So I'll ask about norms of conduct. And so one of the things, Dr. Bartlett, you referred to in your discussion of the play a few times was that the sausage seller was was a better man than Cleon, and I'm curious to pull at that thread. So what made him a better man? And I ask around norms of conduct, so it seems like we could get better norms of conduct in one way if the demos would request that, sort of want that from leaders, but as Dr. Pears said, right, we seem to demand that people play on the same field of means around demagoguery, and so we sort of get what we want there. So I'm interested in how we get those norms. So someone is a good statesman and it has better qualities and people end up recognizing that, but even in the sausage seller, he gave the people the sort of means that they wanted to seem to be a better person. So again, I want to know what about him was better. But I also wonder if there's something to what if elites demanded that of each other? Is that a potential way, sort of a reintroduction of that elite conduct? But again, how likely is that when the level keeps being reduced to the lowest common denominator? But wanted to ask about norms of conduct as potential when boiling seems difficult.
Do you want to go first? Or?
Go ahead.
Just on the character of the sausage seller. Yeah, I find him quite lovable in his way. First of all, he's completely unpretentious and unambitious in the sense of hungering for political power. He works for a living. It's a modest thing, but he does it well, so far as one can tell. He tells some stories about his youth. He may have had a few transgressions here and there, but nothing. He once stole some meat. What he did with it, you can read in the play. But basically, he's not a Boy Scout, but basically on the straight and narrow, and he works hard. Very modest. Nobody's fool. Not fooled for a minute by Cleon. Has zero. He's afraid of him because he's very powerful. And until he gets the backing of the knights, he's not so sure he wants in on this. But he does. He sticks with it. He does have a kind of savvy, political savvy, once he's in the arena. He can go, as I said, toe-to-toe with Cleon. And it's not just his vulgarity or shamelessness. He's clearly, he knows a lot about what Cleon's done both abroad and at home, and he cites these facts, so he's not an ignoramus, about the workings of Athens. Yeah, so he's a sort of everyman who turns out to have pretty sober political judgment in favor of peace over the war, maintains the Navy because a defense is required, but the place, as I said, of the empire is not so clear what's going to happen with that. Certainly no imperial aggrandizement a la Behrakis. That's not on the table. So, yeah, he's not a Boy Scout, but he seems just, and he really loves Mr. Demos. Cleon fakes it and says terrible things about him behind his back. He really is devoted to Athens and to the people of Athens, to put it non-metaphorically. And that's a sincere passion, I think, on the part of the sausage seller. He really wants him to do well, which is why he's the only one in the play who'll criticize Mr. Demos. Now, I suggest that that's impossible in today's democracy, or in any democracy, perhaps. But it happens on the stage, and it's a pointer to something. That we, the demos, you and I, the people, should be less touchy when it comes to serious criticism.
On the norms, it's very hard. I think norms are nearly impossible to recapture once they're lost because it requires the imposition of something that seems so old-fashioned and so constraining. The first 3 or 4 years that I taught the class on demagogues, my students were obsessed with norms. All they wanted to talk about was how important norms are and what constrained they are. Now, I have trouble even sort of making the argument. It seems so outlandish that norms would constrain any kind of leader at all. So I genuinely don't think there's a lot of hope on reinstilling norms in that way, absent some great leader, some really sort of enchanting leader who would come along and behave that way, and then set a new tone such that everyone who follows them looks ridiculous if they don't also behave that way. I'll just throw in answer to the pre-violent question. Demagogues in American politics almost always eventually run up against the fact are serving your own interests and not the interests of the community, ultimately, as long as the electoral system holds in that there is another election, the people are dissatisfied with the results. Demagogues deliver in the end for themselves and not for the people, even the people who they are serving and sort of convincing. So I do think you can, again, as long as there are still elections and those elections are upheld, demagogues eventually run into, and this is not true of the sausage seller, they eventually run up against the fact that they're not very good at governance.
Yeah.
And that the long-term length that the founders hoped would give the people time to reflect on whether they've actually gotten what they were promised, ultimately comes back, and the demagogue has to produce something, or it becomes clear that they are serving their own interests, and even those who are captivated by them or who are following them ultimately don't want to be serving the interests of their leader. They want their own interests served.
That's what Teddy Roosevelt called the Protestants.
It just occurred to me when you were speaking, Emily, that in a way, Aristophanes presents an ideal type of a democratic leader in the sausage seller for all of his many warts. In a way, it may not even be realizable, but it's a kind of type. Yes, Eugene.
I was going to ask, what would you say about a situation that we're in right now that I'll say blatantly people are dissatisfied with both options that they have? So, what then?
Well, for what it's worth, that describes me to a T. I haven't voted for president for a while, and I don't see how I can do it this time. Well, of course, I live in Massachusetts, which means one side will win overwhelmingly. It doesn't matter how I vote. But if I were in a swing state, I'd feel a real... I mean, there is this happy fact, right, that we will never face this election again. Right? Because this is the last swing at the bat for both of them. Now, that doesn't mean the replacements will be better, but let us hope that they will be better. One practical concern I have, and I'm not a political scientist in the sense in which my colleague is a political scientist, that the Republican Party now, it seems to me, will feel a certain obligation or requirement to maintain Trump's base that the country club Republicans won't do by themselves. And how do you maintain that base and their enthusiasm while bringing more traditional Republicans back to the fold? And that would take a remarkable set of qualities, it seems to me. And I doubt it's possible, but we'll see. Now, coalitions can shift over time and so on, and do shift, but it's very difficult. Way in the back.
I'm sorry, I forgot the original context in which you brought this up, but you mentioned something about us younger people, like being like 18 to 22,
Right.
roughly, having to kind of bring about the change that would future generations. And I've heard this a lot, especially as someone I'm going into education, and I had a very similar conversation about this with my professors on Monday. We were talking about privatization of public education, and he was telling, and he assigned us talk with someone who's like, he asked us, we have to talk about what we're going to do to change this. So I asked him, I said, I have no idea what to do. I hear from the older educated generation so much that my generation has to be changed, and I understand that, and I want to do that, but I feel myself and like many other people my age who want to improve our world, we feel directions. So what do we do?
Yeah, it's a perfectly sensible and obviously a fair question. And I just sort of threw out an exhortation which I'm sure you have heard several times. It would take a while, but let me just boil it down to a few things. First of all, you're at a Institute of Higher Education, Higher And I'm hoping at James Madison College, but more broadly too, you get some real grounding in facts about the nature of this country, the character of its founding, its organizing principles, some of the changes that it has undergone for good or for ill, some of which Dr. Pears just went through for us. But what I have in mind simply is this, that you have to take an active, educated concern in the current state and the possibilities of the country. And that will take many different forms. I mean, obviously, some will be to the left, some will be to the right, and some will be in the center, and so on, and various solutions. Libertarianism will save the world. But what's most dangerous, it seems to me, is a retreat. Tocqueville describes this very beautifully already in the second volume of Democracy in America. If you haven't read this book, after the Federalist Papers, that's the most important book you need to read for the present purpose. I wish I were having as much fun as she's having, although I'm having a lot of fun, I should say. I'm not sure that's even legal. He describes this tendency to retreat into the very small sphere of one's own concerns, one's immediate family and friends. And the rest of the world, the country, just goes on. It's somehow a white noise out there. And that's tempting for lots of reasons. And you know, with, what's it called where you wear the thing, the VR or something? We're creating worlds within worlds, you know, into which we can retreat. Meta worlds and so on. Well, but there's a world out there, and so we should fight against the tendency simply to withdraw, either in disgust or indifference or boredom. So that would be a general exhortation. Your education professor and I would probably disagree, and maybe disagree sharply about the direction the country should take, but fine. At least we're both engaged in the same question and the same debate.
Is there anyone else?
This gentleman.
So, I'm all in favor of institutions and facts in reading Aristotle. I find some disagreement about the institutions and the facts, and I find them in a direction that seems to me unwarrantedly elitistic, elitist, and anti-democratic. So, if you look at the fact, Aristophanes didn't get it right. Like, the Athenian democracy was briefly ended by the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War, where the good knights were actually very happy to empower the 30 tyrants and all that followed. Then it was restored and actually continued. Even after Athens lost its independence, it continued to self-govern its local affairs democratically without needing the knights or Demosthenes to find a good sausage seller.
A good?
Sausage seller.
Oh, yes.
Because that's not how it went. Aristophanes was incorrect in its prediction. You didn't need to boil the demos. Instead, the demos itself restored democracy. It was complex, more complex than that, but it was the demos itself that restored democracy because they cared about it. They didn't say, I don't like either choice, I'm not going to vote. They stay engaged. And that seems to me to be the main problems with Americans of today. Like, we have people who are willing to follow crazy people saying crazy things because they are disengaged. They are not connected to their republic, to their democracy. So institutions are great if they function to bring people together. And in relation to the more practical Americanist point of view, you could tell a story that the institutions that the founders laid out gradually failed, etc. You could also tell a story that says that Trump never won a popular majority of the vote and he was only president because of the Electoral College, and then all sorts of other things you could say that are actually anti-majoritarian aspects of the American institutional system that created the most problems. Now, that's not the only way of telling the story, I recognize that. But it is a way, and there is a lot of possibility, particularly in relation to the most recent examples of demagoguery that we are living with. So, I would encourage our students to care about their democracy, be engaged, follow the actual story that happened in Athens and today, and not not lay their hopes into someone coming, bombing the demos and making better, because that is not going to happen. It's not going to work. It's not pleasant to be boiled alive.
On your main, what I take to be your main point, I think I'm in complete agreement about engagement and so on, and I meant to say exactly that just a few moments ago. With regard to Aristophanes, I'm not so sure that he was wrong. You're quite right that toward the end of near the end of the Peloponnesian War, there was a brief reign of the 30, which was a very nasty affair and didn't last very long, and that the democracy, or a kind of democracy, was restored. Actually, Thucydides says, I mean, it's complicated, but toward the end of the book, there was a mixed regime of the 5,000, which he says was the best regime in my lifetime. So it wasn't simply a democracy in their sense of what had been. That lasted, yeah, but
Thucydides wasn't an unbiased observer himself.
No, but, well, perhaps not. That's a long question. The first words of the book are Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote. And the question is whether he was biased in the sense that he was an Athenian or biased in the sense that he was a philosopher. And I'm inclined to the latter view. That's a long question. But the Athenian democracy did decline. It ceased to be what it was after the Peloponnesian War. It was spent, basically. Yeah, sure, it continued in some form or other for a long time, but the question is not only mere existence, but the quality of that existence. You characterize the debate or the discussion as elitist, and I would say that's probably right. But then from a certain point of view, from the Athenian democratic point of view, the United States is a quote-unquote elitist institution or arrangement. And they were very concerned for reasons that were brought out about the dangers of demagoguery and so on, and an attempt to refine the electorate and its judgment. So on what I take to be your main point, I agree. I disagree, I think, about whether Aristophanes, how prescient he was. I think he was, probably. And yes, it's true that Mr. Dema, boiling someone is a difficult affair, but I stress that in my remarks. What's the real world equivalent of that? I'm not sure that there is one. Aristophanes did what he could within the limits of his remarkable powers to educate, chastise, and improve the people who after all, made up his audience. Now, that's a peculiar approach because he was a comic poet, but as I say, he used the tools that were at his disposal.
So I think you're right that the most likely progression of American democracy in the next 50 years is a speeding up of the move towards something closer to direct democracy. I think at the end of the electoral college, a national popular vote, and the elimination of as many institutions that seem sort of elitist or seem to distance the outcome of lawmaking from what the public wants. I think that's where we're heading. I also think that as that happens, a lot of people are going to look around and be very concerned. My students are adamant populists and hold minority views. And that's a really tough situation to be in, right? To be sort of adamant that what the majority wants should become law, and also hold minority views. I mean, it means there's going to be a lot of people who lose out in the lawmaking process all the time, and I think even more so than they're sort of losing out now. And so I'm not sure how that plays out. Part of the reason for the founders creating this distance is that the people are willing to throw away not only the rights of others, but often their own rights. Right? They will vote for policies that are the things that are most appealing, that they want, even if those policies violate the rights that they've chosen to enshrine in their constitution or protect in their constitution. So a lot of these systems are meant to ensure that we don't take those steps, that we don't pass laws that are in violation of our own or others' rights. And as we dismantle what are certainly elitist sort of filtering mechanisms, I'm not sure how the public sort of responds to then coming up against the majority's willingness to pass laws that do violate those rights.
There was a student's hand in the back. Yes.
So, yesterday there was a lecture where we talked about arms control and how it's really lost its appeal to the American electorate. The big problem there is that nobody's really interested in great governance anymore. And I see a lot of parallel between that lecture and this lecture. So my question is, you have two parties, both Democrats and Republicans. Where does our alternative come from? We've created a two-party system where there's really no space for independent. So do we have to just get rid of the two-party system? Do we need to pass some sort of generational reform that is somewhat nebulously teacher basically? Maybe that's impossible. I don't think it's a solution that's workable.
I mean, the short answer is I'm not sure. I don't. There are real problems, obviously, with the two-party system. That's chiefly well, it plays a large role in explaining how we got to where we are with two candidates who seem to be unacceptable, or at least to do a good chunk of the electorate. I don't know if that will require the abolition of the two-party system, or whether the two-party systems can be reformed in some way. It's just beyond my ken to know. Or a viability of a third party? I don't know. Do you want to say anything to this?
You gotta vote in primaries. Nobody's voting in primaries, right? If you don't like the two parties, the parties are actually the easiest thing to move in the American electoral system, in the American democratic system overall. The party platforms can change. The smallest group of people could have the greatest effect on the party platforms and the party nominees. But most of us are leaving those decisions up to a very small group of people. And so before you sort of throw your arms up and say, well, the two-party system is broken, I would say I think there's a lot of paths to change of the what the two parties are standing for. If a whole bunch of people suddenly decide to get really involved in state party committees, in state party active, if you go to these events and you look around the room, you're going to see people who look like you, right? And so that's one thing. I wouldn't be so I wouldn't give up so quickly on the two-party system. I think it's movable.
That strikes me as a very clear, actionable item. Yes.
Yeah. Two questions. I think I heard you mention earlier about the good demagogue and bad demagogue.
Yeah.
And I wondered about the definition between that. And I want to take a risk at putting something I think that's spoiling the themes, because I think one of the things that has changed the political landscape in America is the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And I think a certain portion, maybe the whole thing was spoiled and had different outcomes and stuff, but I think that has really changed or solidified some things. Maybe it's also related to people not delivering or actually delivering on something that people don't want.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. With regard to the good and bad demagoguery, in the first place, I just had a kind of linguistic point, that the term was not originally necessarily pejorative, leading the demos. And one could think, so if you take away the necessarily pejorative connotation to it, you could say Lincoln was a demagogue. He led the people in a good sense. And I guess I would say that. In other words, democracy is the rule of the demos, the people, sure. But as a matter of fact or practice, there tend to be leaders who arise, who guide them. And they can do it well or they can do it poorly. But as I also said, already in Aristophanes, it's not a compliment. And the main demagogue, of course, is that he treats as, of course, Cleon. On Roe v. Wade, I would just say that I will repeat to you something that one of my colleagues, whose judgment in American politics I respect greatly, he said the following. He said, and this is, I'm quoting him, "I am a Democrat, I am pro-choice, and I'm anti-Roe v. Wade." And he had a very interesting explanation of that he thought it was very bad that the question was decided in the way that it was, imposed from on high, and that he thinks it would have been better, both as a matter of policy and for the Democratic Party, of which he's a long-standing member, if it had been permitted to have a political solution from the bottom up, rather than a judicial decision imposed from the front, up from the top. I mean, maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, I don't know. But I was very struck by this argument that he made and the way that he put it. And so what we're seeing now is a more democratic working through 30 years, or whatever it was, 40 years more, of the same policy question, but in a through political means. And I think he thinks, again, I'm speaking for him, it will end up in a better place and it's politically more healthy. And he also said he thinks it'll benefit, as I said, the Democratic Party going forward. Because the majority of the country seems to be more pro-choice than pro-life. Did you want to speak to this? Dick.
I want to bring us back, and maybe, I don't know what time it is, but it must be
7.
7.
5 of.
Yeah, we probably should coming to a conclusion soon, although I don't want to dictate that. But I want to bring us back to comedy.
Good.
If not necessarily.
Because I've managed to depress most of the people in the audience. So.
If not laughter. And you said a number of things almost in passing about comedy and about Aristophanes as a comic poet. And I wonder if you could elaborate on some of them. And what I mean by this is, the relationship between the poet and the political community is what I'm trying to get at. And I'm trying to get at Aristophanes' understanding of it, but also your own understanding of it. Also, there's the question of the relationship between different kinds of poetry and different regimes. So one of the things that is most attractive about Athens is the fact that they consistently voted Aristophanes' comedies the best.
Yeah.
Now that shows a pretty high degree of refined taste. Now they may not have voted for Aristophanes' comedies for the same reasons that Aristophanes would have preferred that they
Precisely, yes.
But still, and this is Athens in its, from Aristophanes, in its decline. This is the Athens in which Aeschylus is no longer the tragic poet. Even Sophocles is no longer the tragic poet. Euripides, who is very different than Aristophanes, it seems.
Euripides appears in some of the plays,
So
but he gets mocked.
So one simple way of putting this is, what exactly is and should be the relationship between the artist, generalize it, and the political community? Because it is very odd to think about the situation in which old, healthy Athens likes Aristophanes as much as decayed Athens does. And even whether old, healthy Athens has need of an Aristophanes. And then, of course, there's the other part which you talked about is whether, even if it has need of an Aristophanes, and even if Aristophanes could do some good, he can't qualitatively transform the situation, no matter how good a comic poet is.
Yeah. It's a very long and complex question. But it is one that is of very great concern to Aristophanes when you ask your question to him, to the text, the 11 plays that have come down to us. It's surprising the extent to which he has discussions of this. He discusses the audience, the breakdown in the audience between the laughers and the wise, he says. I could give this example from the Clouds, which some of you have probably read, Aristophanes' Clouds. We're getting a report from a student who talks too much about Socrates' doings in his investigations. You know? And as you may know, later Socrates was convicted and killed on a charge of not believing in the gods of the city and corrupting the young. And there's 3 examples. And the first 2 just seem ridiculous on their face. How far can a flea jump in terms of a flea's own feet? But the third example has always struck me. It's an astronomical experiment or measuring of the celestial bodies. Right? That's not funny in itself. And at least according to orthodoxy, those were gods who moved of their own will. They were not hunks of rock. And to say that they were hunks of rock, depending on where you said it and to whom, could get you into trouble. But what Aristophanes does, so he presents 2 apparently ridiculous experiments, and then astronomy, which is not ridiculous and not funny. But he has, according to the report, as Socrates was looking up into the heavens, a lizard crap on Socrates' head. And this has always struck me. The lizard crapping is funny. Astronomy is not funny. And it shows that he's willing to go so far as to present Socrates as an astronomer, but on top there has to be the lizard. And the lizard will distract some people from the more dangerous thing, or attempt. So that in other words, there's many, many, many dirty jokes in Aristophanes. It really, my vocabulary in Greek expanded remarkably when I first started reading Aristophanes. Bathroom jokes, sexual jokes, really some raunchy stuff. I mean, but funny, if that's your taste. Going together with the claim to wisdom, to teach justice, you know. And I don't have a worked out theory of this, but it does seem to me that, and I said this at lunch when we had lunch with Peggy, it seems to me just phenomenologically on observation, you can't combine, it's physically impossible to combine anger and humor in the same soul at the same time. If you're really angry, you can't laugh, and if you're laughing, you can't be really angry. And Aristophanes walked a very fine line, it seems to me, between mocking things which in certain polite circles are not mock-worthy or can't be mocked. But he did it. He pushed certain boundaries. Zeus never appears in the plays, but Dionysus does, and he's subjected to all manner of humiliations. But he's not Zeus. You know, he's Aristophanes, but he goes pretty far in mocking the gods and so on. The birds, there's a whole revolution against the Olympian gods. So, to be brief, since we're running out of time, it seems to me that Aristophanes' fundamental concern was the truth, wisdom. And he says as much himself. He wanted to figure things out. But his medium was a peculiarly public one. And he took his public responsibility seriously, I think. And he both taught as he amused. And that's a very difficult thing to combine. Some people would take away the jokes more than the teaching, and some might take away more the teaching than the jokes. And there are probably levels to the teaching, too. But that he was celebrated to the extent that he was has always been a remarkable thing to me. It seems to me impossible, well, I'll speculate, it would have been impossible for him to be the success that he was when Athens was at its morally strictest. I allude to this at the very end of my remarks. Whereas certain kinds of decline, political decline, can go together with a kind of loosening which can be good for the mind. No Aristophanes, so far as I know, in Iran, for example. You know, it's too strict a place. So much isn't funny.
No Aristophanes was German.
Yeah, as someone said, you know, the country without comedy. Should we? well, I want to thank you all very much for what, for me, it was a pleasant and informative meeting, as I hope it was for you too. Thank you.